Hi folks, Lawrence Patias here for the week on emotion and memory for this course, Trauma, Memory and Law. Now we're going to establish a couple of things in this week which are quite important for legal cases. One is, probably the most relevant thing, is that memories of emotion can change over time. So when somebody testifies in court or they decide to bring charges because of memories of distress or memories of certain emotions, it's just good to know that there's a literature out there that shows that memory of emotions can change if our current cognitions change. What I also want to tell you about is the theories of emotion that get us into trouble, such as catharsis theory, why it's out of date, and what theories of emotion can replace it. The reason I want to tell you that is because some of the therapies that cause problems in distorting memories believe in catharsis theory, and then it leads to memory distortions of some sort. I'll try and explain to you why, and then you can argue the case yourself. You can see and argue the case why catharsis theories have caused so much problem. Indeed, cathartic type of ideas were behind memory distortions that led to false memories and then court cases later on. Bear with me, there is a reason why I'm explaining basic theories of emotion. I hope it affects the way you think about everything too. It certainly did me. I think it's a very valuable thing to have. Just in a general sense, you need to understand how emotions work for everything in psychology, including forensic psychology. So let's start out talking in this lecture just about emotion theories, right? So let's start out by saying affect is an umbrella term that covers both emotions and moods. And then you ask yourself, well, what is an emotion and a mood? Well, they're different. An emotion means an affective state that is specific to one stimuli and does not last long, right? So you can be happy because you achieved something, and then the happiness fades over time. Or, being angry at somebody for cutting you off, that's an emotion. A mood usually is meant to mean a non-specific feeling and not necessarily attached to an obvious stimuli, and it lasts a long time. All right, so those are the terms that you might find in the psychological science type articles on emotion. One of the earliest theories of emotion, in modern times I should say, is Charles Darwin's theory that came out of his book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. Now, some of his ideas were quite reasonable, but some of them you can see you might think influenced Freud's theory of catharsis when you think about it. So his three principles included the principle of serviceable habits, the idea that old movements of the face in old ancestors of humans in lower mammals, for example, had a function at the time, but that function has been co-opted in emotional expression in the face. Another concept that he had was the principle of antithesis, which is some actions or habits are carried out merely because they are the opposite in nature to a serviceable habit. So sometimes the opposite type of movement is co-opted later on to be expressed as an emotion. And the example that Darwin gave is the shrugging of the shoulders. But I want you to focus on the third principle that Darwin proposed, which is a principle of expressive habits or nervous discharge from the nervous system. This is perhaps a flawed idea. This principle proposes that some habits are performed because of a build-up to the nervous system, which causes a discharge of excitement. Examples might be foot or finger tapping, as well as vocal expressions, etc. So this might have been the seed of the idea that emotions build up and then are discharged later. I don't think it's really a correct idea. Now we know physiology better, there's no real energy that builds up as emotion. That's not what we've discovered as mechanisms. Remember that Darwin talked about the principle of expressive habits. a nervous discharge of energy, of emotions, and compare it to what Freud believed and what some catharsis theorists still believe today. After Darwin, William James came up with a theory of emotion in this paper. It was called the James-Lange theory because Lange also came up with something similar at about the same time. And it goes like this. William James emphasized physiology, and that physiology may be primary and distinct for each emotion. All right, so every type of emotion, such as happiness, has a certain physiology, which is different from sadness, which is different from anger, and so on. That was his idea. It did not work out that way, but that was his idea. Now, in this theory, James and Lange suggested that emotions occur as a result of the physiological reaction to events, right? So you see the event, you have a physiological reaction that is unique to every emotion. You then identify which emotion you're feeling right at the end, right? So if you look at this diagram here, you witness an external stimulus. Number two, the stimulus leads to a specific physiological response, which is very unique to every emotion. This turns out not to be true, by the way. And then your emotional reaction comes from your reaction and your interpretation of your physical response. All right. The other thing that James and Lange said, for example, is that you see a bear, you react with fear and goosebumps or something like that, and then you look at yourself, kind of, a bit silly way to say it, but you look at your reaction and then you say, I'm feeling fear. I'm not so sure that works out, but it's an important theory that was very influential. Now, Cannon and Bard were the first to properly question James Lange theory of emotion. And what they went on to say is that they disagree with James Lange theory. They think that the brain generates physiological responses and emotions at the same time. They didn't think that you create the physiological response first when you see a stimulus and then you interpret that and then feel the emotion later at the same time. Why did they think this? Because of the experiments they did and others did with cats that involve cutting the sympathetic nerves, the arousing nerves in the brain, and the cats still exhibited typical emotions, especially rage. The point is, they found that the cat had emotions even without physiological information fed to the brain, right? So James Lange is doubtful. And because these cats that did have the cortex removed still exhibited emotions, they proposed that it was perhaps the thalamus, which is part of the underbrain, which was not removed, was the source of emotions. And that idea that our emotions come from the lower brain has remained. There might be a little bit of truth to it, but you can see why people later would think that the lower brain produces the energy for emotions and then the upper brain regulates that. There may be a little bit of truth to that, although I don't think we believe that the thalamus is the center of emotion like Cannon and Bard did. We've moved on since then. Now, another important influential paper on emotion, and this was the real breakthrough, is Schachter and Singer research that involved humans being given an epinephrine shot and then them being influenced by an actor with them in the same room, and one actor would act happily with some participants, another actor would act angrily, and the epinephrine surge got interpreted as anger in one group when they're influenced by social factors, and by joy and euphoria in the other group. So it kind of proved in humans that our perceptions of the social state help us perceive whether the excitement we feel is anger or euphoria. So in other words, social factor is important in us deciding which emotion that we're feeling. So to summarize these theories, Darwin suggested emotions evolved from body or face movements that had an adaptive function. Of course, Darwin also said that there may be neural discharge of emotion, and that's how it might work. It's doubtful. The James Lange theory stated that emotions are the result of physiological responses in the body, and then you interpret those physiological responses, and then you say, oh, I'm feeling this emotion. Canembard did a good job of debunking that, but they made their own mistakes. They proposed that no, you can still have emotions without the interpretation. So they proposed the thalamic origin of emotion. Of course, they only really observed very basic emotions such as rage in their cats. So maybe more complex emotions might actually come from the cortex. And indeed, I think they do. They're connected to the cortex, at least. And then according to Schachter and Singer, physiology and cognition work together to form emotions, social factors in cognition. So those are the basic theories to help us move on into comparing catharsis theory to cognitive appraisal theory. You can probably guess that catharsis theory came a little bit from Darwin's mistake, and then Freud picked up on it. And you might see that cognitive appraisal theory might have come out of Schachter and Singer's work, and you'd be approximately right, although there was a little bit of work that we haven't talked about by MAGDA Arnold, which was important in the cognitive appraisal theory. So first of all, let's talk about catharsis theory. Now, Joseph Breuer and Freud were one of the first, others were probably talking about it before, but one of the first to talk about the idea of catharsis, the build-up of emotions in the body, as if emotion is a substance, and then it builds up to such an extent that it's bottled up. And then if it's bottled up and it creates pressure like a steam engine, then it causes neurotic problems unless you release the steam. Do you think Freud could have been influenced by cultural ideas and the steam engine, right? So the things that he talked about, and this is a quote from his paper with Breuer, if this reaction takes place to a sufficient amount, a large part of the affect disappears as a result. Linguistic usage bears witness to this fact of daily observations by such phrases such as to cry oneself out and to blow off steam, literally to rage oneself out. If the reaction is suppressed, the affect remains attached to the memory. Right, so he's taking from wordplay in German, such as to cry oneself out. So obviously in society they already had this idea that emotion is stored and then you release it. And he's picking up on that, right? And he's forming and formalizing his theory here. And he says if you suppress that emotion, this is very important too, the affect remains attached to the memory. So it's almost like that's the problem in Freud's view. You have a traumatic memory and then the affect is attached to it. His idea was maybe relive the memory and then release the emotion, and then you stop having symptoms. Freud and Breuer also wrote, each individual hysterical symptom immediately and permanently disappeared when we had succeeded in bringing clearly to light the memory of the event, he's talking about trauma, by which it was provoked, and arousing its accompanying affect, right? So bringing up the emotion again. And when the patient had described that event in the greatest possible detail and had put the affect into words, right? So this is where the idea comes from, that if you can arouse the emotion that was suppressed originally, then you get cured. Look at this first statement. Each individual hysterical symptom, that means every symptom that his patient had, all of his patients, I think he's saying here, immediately and permanently disappeared. I think he's lying there. I think he was exaggerating the results of his clinical work, but that's another story. So this is his theory, and it influences the whole of society. You know, jurors and judges might have this model of emotion when they're judging a case. So this, like I said, this is claiming a complete cure. Do you see where the motivation comes from to do this kind of digging for old memories now? And for more on Freud, you can read Frederick Crew's work. Now, the article by Bushman is one of the seminal papers, in my view, in questioning whether catharsis theory is actually true. According to catharsis theory, if you express anger, you should feel less angry later. But what Bushman found here is that if you express anger, you feel more angry later, which put catharsis theory into doubt. So what Bushman said in his paper is doing nothing at all, the group that did nothing at all, was more effective than venting anger in reducing anger. And what about other emotions? I'm not sure. I emailed Brad Bushman about this and he was not sure either. There may be some clues out there that I'm just not aware of. Now, a recommended reading here is an encyclopedia article about catharsis by Jeffrey Law and Adams. And this is what they wrote together about catharsis theory. So they say that the concept of catharsis has infiltrated many languages in the form of the pressure cooker metaphor. It is said that people are like pressure cookers and that negative emotions are like steam vapor inside the cooker. The venting of the steam through the release valve keeps the vessel from exploding in a destructive way. You can see how we use physical analogies to try and understand the mental world, right? It's very common, like steam building up in a substance. An alternative view is that venting or catharsis becomes a habit because of the commonplace observation that people report feeling better having done so. This is what I think is happening, and this is why the theory is so powerful and it's still in society today. It's because we feel better when we vent emotion. So we mistake that short-term feeling of euphoria with a long-term benefit of the emotion permanently getting out. But if we think carefully about it, we know that over time, anger doesn't decrease if we constantly vent it. Now let's move on to the replacement theory that I think is a good theory, so that I don't just debunk all the bad theories. Now, the cognitive appraisal theory of emotions is something that, for me, makes rational sense. It makes sense that we perceive the environment, perceive our goals within the environment, and perceive blockages to those goals or not. And that perception produces an emotion. So cognitive appraisals of the environment, which includes the surroundings, the physical surroundings, and the agents within the surroundings, such as other people, basically, or other organisms too, if they're blocking your goals, and the agent's intentions, right? So if you perceive what the other person's intention is, if they're blocking you from doing something, those appraisals are a major cause of emotions. There may be other slight causes. I think this is a major cause. Other slight causes might be your physiology at the time, drugs in the system, your tiredness. Those might moderate emotions as well. And it makes sense, right? If you think about it. So why would somebody be angry? It's because they perceive that somebody else or something else is blocking them from getting to their goal. That takes perception, right, of your goal, and it takes perception of somebody blocking you or something blocking you. Those are all cognitive appraisals of the environment. And of course, that perception causes the emotion. I mean, isn't it self-evident? I don't know. But it's also empirical too. There's some empirical evidence for this. If you measure people's appraisals of the environment or the appraisals of a person, let's say, that is always highly correlated with the emotions that they feel towards that event, right? So if, for example, if you appraise a person very highly, then you're going to feel higher positive emotions towards that person. So this is a general diagram to remember, right? So cognitive appraisals are a cause of emotions. In Freud's theory, catharsis theory, it's kind of like emotion is the cause of other things, right? But here, it's not. Emotions is not the cause, it's the output or the effect. And here I put this down. Emotions are seen as more of an output than a substance. Catharsis theory sees emotions as an entity that is stored or a substance that is stored. And again, we've found no physiological evidence of any substance like that being stored. We've only discovered things like neurotransmitters, but they're not emotions, and so on. One of the influential papers that put out a theory of cognitive appraisals, theory of emotion, was Lazarus's work. And he did work back in the 70s and 80s as well on this. But he summarized it here in an article in American Psychologist, basically saying that appraisals are the cause of emotions. He also believed that cognitions came before emotions. Now, he went into great detail and made the theory very complicated because human emotions are quite complicated, right? So you have to explain happiness, you have to explain distress, you have to explain anger, and so on. And before Lazarus, Magda Arnold had a lot of influence on cognitive appraisal theory without much empirical evidence, but she came up with some good ideas. So in this paper in 1945, she started to find fault with the Cannon-Bard theory, but she did not emphasize cognition yet. But by 1960, perhaps influenced by other people, in her book Emotion and Personality, she started to outline what has been described as the first cognitive appraisal theory of emotion, right? The articles are sometimes so difficult to understand because they're trying to explain how certain different perceptions would lead to certain different emotions, but basic theory, I hope I'm simplifying it here, is that our evaluation of the environment produces emotional responses if they're important to us, right? So if our appraisal includes a goal of some sort, such as survival, reproduction, or a physical goal that we can see, if you block it, that's going to release an emotion. If you facilitate it, it's going to release an emotion. You know, in other words, if you get helped by somebody, you're going to feel great emotion. Or if you're blocked by somebody from a goal, you're going to feel great emotion, right? So it has to be important to produce an emotion. Now, in contrast to Lazarus, Zions here argued that emotions sometimes come before cognition. Now, there may be rare cases where that might be true, right? So if you're thinking about basic rage, for example, in cats that do not have cognitive capacity in early experiments, yes, in that case, you might say rage does not require cognition in that case. But I think for the most part, cognition comes before emotion. And Zions argued that emotion and cognition are different systems. In reply to Zions, he argued that cognitions come before emotion. For the most part, I think he turned out to be right, although it's difficult actually to measure. Even now, it's difficult to measure. So how do you measure whether cognitions are coming before emotions? Because they seem to appear simultaneously sometimes. And how do you separate cognitions from emotions? I mean, aren't emotions a type of cognition anyway? And Lazarus emphasized that cognitions and emotions are intertwined. Actually, that's just what I was saying as well, wasn't it? Now, moving on from pure appraisal theories, in affective forecasting, they found we're not very good at guessing how we will feel in the future. It's a basic message. We tend to overestimate the intensity and duration of future events. So, for example, when we think about winning a lottery, we overestimate how intensely happy we will be and overestimate how long we will be happy. Same with tragedy, such as if you acquire a disability in the middle of life, we expect that we'll feel extremely intense negative emotions for a very long time. In fact, we feel less intense emotions as we adapt for less long time as well. So that's an interesting finding that helps round out our understanding of emotion. And that same team also did this other work on affective adaptation. So the finding that they have here is when you're first presented with a stimulus, we have a strong emotional reaction. Like, so first time we see video of 9/11 or something like that. But then in the meantime, we start to explain that to ourselves. We start to integrate it. We start to think about it. We connect it to other things. We talk about it. And because of that explaining away, the second time we see the stimulus again, we have a less strong emotional reaction. So I'm just illustrating here basically that there's some really nice research into emotions that is not up in the air and inaccurate like catharsis theory. There's a whole branch of affective science that is reliable science as far as I can tell. There might be some bad findings in there, but it's just there for you to investigate if you're interested. Okay, so what did we talk about in this lecture? We talked about catharsis theory. We debunked it in a certain sense. We haven't found any evidence that there's a substance that stores emotions in the neurological system. There's doubts about catharsis theory because of Bushman's work on anger. It doesn't really work to vent it. And we've replaced that theory with what I think is a good theory to help guide clinicians, to help guide psychologists, and that's appraisal theory of emotion. And the appraisal theory is emotion is not a substance. It's an output from our cognitions. Makes sense, and it's got some empirical evidence behind it as well. It's the foundation for what we're going to add on next, which is we're going to be talking about memories of emotion, which might be relevant in the forensic field. And I look forward to telling you about that later. Okay, see you next time.